Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. A few months ago, maybe it was weeks ago, I've completely lost track of time. We were joined by Charlie Warzel, who's the author of the Galaxy Brain newsletter, former New York Times reporter. And by popular demand, folks really wanted him to come back. So, Charlie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I am happy to be here.
Well, since we spoke last, you've actually launched a new venture. You moved the newsletter Galaxy Brain to The Atlantic. Also, you're out with a new book, co-author of this new book, Out of Office, The Big Problem and Bigger Promise of Working from Home, which you wrote with your partner, Anne Helen Peterson. So congratulations on that as well.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
So before we get into any of that, and I know this is like a flashback to your previous life when you used to write about the right-wing fever swamps. You tracked the whirlwind of crazy when it was sort of out there in the fever swamps. And now we're realizing that that whole whirlwind had engulfed the White House over the last several years, including the events surrounding January 6th. You and I were chatting just briefly. I would think that after 4 or 5 or 6 years of following these guys, we would have lost our capacity to be shocked. But still, it's kind of amazing some of the things that are coming out, including these text messages. I mean, how do you feel about this? I mean, you've been writing about this, the crazy right wing and everything, but to see the PowerPoint, to see Mark Meadows' text messages, it's still amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that the slide deck comes for us all at some point. That's the first lesson. The texts that I found probably the most interesting were the ones from the Fox News primetime lineup, and the way that it showed that all of those people were actually having the same reaction to the images from January 6th as we were. I mean, maybe not exactly the same, but what they saw was truly terrifying, and they were worried about it. They were worried for political reasons, but they were still concerned.
But they adapted very, very quickly, including by that night. So since you mentioned that, let's play a little of a soundbite. I think one of the most dramatic developments last night was Liz Cheney, the vice chairman of the January 6th committee, is actually reading aloud during the debate over criminal contempt charges against Mark Meadows, reading aloud some of these texts. Let's just play about a minute and a half of this.
According to the records, multiple Fox News hosts knew the president needed to act immediately. They texted Mr. Meadows, and he has turned over those texts. Quote, Mark, the president needs to tell people in the Capitol to go home. This is hurting all of us. He is destroying his legacy, Laura Ingraham wrote. Please get him on TV. Destroying everything you have accomplished, Brian Kilmeade texted. Quote, can he make a statement? Ask people to leave the Capitol, Sean Hannity urged. As the violence continued, one of the president's sons texted Mr. Meadows, quote, he's got to condemn this shit ASAP. The Capitol Police tweet is not enough, Donald Trump Jr. texted. Meadows responded, quote, I'm pushing it hard. I agree. Still, President Trump did not immediately act. Donald Trump Jr. texted again and again, urging action by the president. Quote, we need an Oval Office address. He has to lead now. It has gone too far and gotten out of hand, end quote. But hours passed without necessary action by the president. These non-privileged texts are further evidence of President Trump's supreme dereliction of duty during those 187 minutes.
So, Charlie Warzel, what's really striking about this is they all knew. They all knew at the time that it was terrible. I mean, including people who have since tried to retcon the whole experience. It was no big deal. It was exaggerated. It was a tourist visit. Now we're finding out that they knew exactly what was going on. I think, and I want to get your reaction to this, Laura Ingraham is the most interesting in many ways because she was saying, how terrible this was, this destroys. But then that night she goes on the air and begins leading with maybe it was Antifa sympathizers or provocateurs. One point suggesting to Kevin McCarthy that only 36 people were involved, but now we know that what she was saying privately bears almost no resemblance to what these folks said publicly to their audience. Rather extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a great look at how these folks are propagandists.
Mm-hmm.
That what it really reminds me of is my time when I was reporting on. We talked about this last time, Alex Jones, and spending time talking to former staffers at InfoWars and people that knew Alex through different points of his life and career. And there was this entire conversation around. I was profiling him around whether or not Alex believed what he says, and it became very. It was an obsession of mine to think.
Yeah.
Okay, I got to know: is this guy acting? Is he a true believer? And it became just incredibly clear, a month or so into the reporting, then none of that matters. And I think it's a very, because what matters is the words that get disseminated to millions. I mean, if this is obviously really damning evidence that this group is willing to memory hole an event that as they witnessed, was terrifying. But at the same time, it doesn't matter what their private actions say or what they. It's all that matters is what they choose to tell their audience of millions every night in the way that they basically con them. And the last thing I'll say is when you hear Liz Cheney read those texts and hear the president's son pleading, these Fox News hosts pleading, the only thing I can think of is, man, all these people want to do this again for another 4 years, huh? Like
Isn't
this
that
thing
amazing?
where they
Yeah.
have to, where crazy stuff happens that is super dangerous and scary, and they have to plead with the president's handler to, try to get him to quell the chaos. It really sounds like a fun time that I would love to see the sequel.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's do this all over again. Let's put him back in the Oval Office. I think it was a year ago today, by the way, that Bill Barr resigned as Attorney General. We haven't heard much from him lately. See, the problem, of course, with stories like this, and you can tell that the Fox News folks find this embarrassing because they haven't even mentioned it this morning. None of them have reported on it. This was, of course, leading every other discussion about what happened over the last 24 hours. Not even mentioned by any of the hosts whose texts were read. But ultimately, Charlie, you know that it won't really hurt Fox because, as my colleague Sarah Longwell tweeted out, they'll weather it because nobody really at this point expects more from Fox. I mean, there's not going to be no indignation that really Fox News hosts have been shilling for the president and his legacy. Yes, we kind of knew that, right? Plus, their audience doesn't care if they even ever hear about it. So this is not going to be one of those turning points for, okay, now people realize that Fox News is just propaganda, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point because I do think it's easy to get kind of caught up in the the daily dramas of all of this. And it's not to say that something like a commission on January 6th isn't important. It is. But the way that our media ecosystem is now set up, with the right-wing media ecosystem just so operating completely autonomously, let's say,
Right.
it really doesn't matter. I mean, the thing that I sort of, I think, secretly hope for when I see that is that the diehard MAGA true believers will cast out Hannity or Laura
Yeah.
Ingraham because they're not necessarily true believers. But at this point, it doesn't really matter. People are just, they're signing up for what they want, which is a direct line of propaganda, right into the vein, and that's what they're getting.
Well, and as you point out, I mean, I think people need to also understand that it is an ecosystem. It's not just one outlet. Every time, someone says, well, the real problem here is Fox News, I always say, okay, but it's Fox News, but you have to understand there's an entire universe around Fox News that people get their information in this. And again, ecosystem is the best term that I can come up. Alternative reality silo that's reinforced, but also make sure that nobody goes too far, right? I mean, Fox News is constrained by what it can do because lives in the universe where its audience gets information from Facebook, from a variety of different sources out there. They have competition from OAN and from Newsmax. So there is this whole sort of cloud of acceptable opinions and alternative realities that they exist in that's pretty much impenetrable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good example of I think a lot of people feel this in electoral politics, but they're obviously I'm not trying to take their autonomy away from them and the decisions that they make, but there's this idea that they're almost all kind of held captive by the true believers, right? There's a lot of people who don't want to make the full MAGA pivot, but they have no choice but to do it if they want to stay, active in the party and have, proximity to power.
Right.
And I think it's the same with the media ecosystem, right? Like you hear about people at Fox News who either leave or who say, oh, I didn't like that. But they're kind of held captive to the audience that wants the absolute most extreme, version of this news. And because there is an ecosystem built all around, like you said, that exists from from Facebook pages to trolls on message boards to whatever anonymous Twitter accounts, you kind of have to keep up with the Joneses in that
right.
sense. And so in some sense I'm sure there are people at Fox News who and again, this makes it very shameless, right? But who are who are saying and doing things they don't necessarily want to do, or maybe that they don't necessarily believe because that's what they have to do to feed that audience.
And ultimately, that was the decision that Chris Wallace had to make, right? That I could either stay here and play this game, or I just need to leave. I just need to get out of this bubble, which of course he did.
Yeah, and I think
Shepard Smith made the same decision.
I think that there were a lot of people that I saw reacting and saying, "Oh man, well, Fox is just like, I mean, now what do they have?" And it's and there's no universe or there's no reality, let's say, where where Chris Wallace is actually the last line of defense. I mean, he was just an outsider at this point at the networks, and
Right.
I don't think any one person being there can save Fox for what it is. If anything, it casts having no sort of real news person to act as a shield or as a cover for your operation in some ways just makes the reality more clear, which is that Fox is obviously a lost cause there.
So let's pivot a little bit here. I've been, like everybody else, trying to look back at 2021, the various themes, the reality versus the expectations, and clearly one of the great developments of the year has been our relationship to work. So your book has come out at a very, very timely moment. Again, the book is Out of Office: The Big Problem and the Bigger Promise of Working from Home. We are a nation of workaholics, but you argue that you think we've now reached an inflection point, that this pandemic, which has affected us all in so many different ways, but the most significant seems to be how and when we work. And especially for people like me and you, who've been doing it remotely since early, 2020, where we work. So pre-pandemic, we Americans work more hours than their counterparts in comparable countries. So we are a nation of workaholics. So talk to me a little bit about this and why you think that this last year has been such an inflection point.
So I think the most interesting bit of this is that technology has enabled us to be so much more available with our work. We are constantly sort of tethered to our jobs at all times. And the promise of that technology is a little bit more flexibility, right? If you can work anytime, well then maybe you should be able to work anywhere. But even as all this technology came to the fore and became adopted and our jobs became connected to the internet, for years people asked their bosses, "Hey, can I work Friday from home, or can I
Right.
I got an elderly mother. I would really love to go and visit and take care for a couple of weeks." And whatever it is, people have been asking their bosses, their employers, for flexibility, and the employers have a standard line for all these multiple decades, which is if you leave the nucleus of the office, everything is going to unravel. Productivity is going to plummet. The company culture is not going to be held together, or it'll grow toxic. It is extremely important that we all be in this space for reasons maybe you don't even understand. What the pandemic did, I like to think of it as like a control experiment, where we all completely changed the way that we work in the knowledge work industry. And what ended up happening was everything kept going, right? Nothing catastrophic happened. Productivity was just fine. It was difficult, obviously, because of a pandemic, but we got through it. And so people are looking at that and they're saying, man, that line was BS. Well, what else about the way that we work is BS, or is simply a line from my employer that benefits them, to my detriment? And I think that, that sounds very simple, but I think it's a really profound thing, because it causes people to question the first principles about the way that they work. And if you start doing that, as speaking from personal experience and from the 700 people we've interviewed for this book, it leads you to some really interesting places. It really does. It's that, I think, is what this moment is about. It is an opening of the mind to say, wow, like, what are all these vestigial elements of work that no longer make sense? And it seems like they've been driving me crazy. So let's try to find a better way.
See, the way you sketch out what happened, I think is going to resonate with a lot of people because, okay, we start working from home during the pandemic. There's this obsession with productivity, really felt like it ramped up. People really doubled down on their jobs because they didn't want to be laid off. They were worried about what was going to happen, right? But then at some point, that, after all of the slacking, the emails, the Zoom meetings, people hit a wall of burnout. When talk to me about that, because I think a lot of us can recognize that maybe initially there was this concern. Well, people are not going to be coming into the office; they won't be working that hard. In fact, they were never not working. I think one of the things that I've experienced is that you would think that I would have all of this extra freedom, but when I actually went to work, there was that line where I was at work and then I was not at work. Now it's all blurred, right? You're always at work. You're always online. You're always on call. So when did the burnout really hit?
Well, I think we've been building to that for a long time in American office culture. And some people obviously were burned out before the pandemic. The reason why we titled the book, The Big Problem and Bigger Promise, speaks to these two things, right? The big problem is exactly what you described with remote work, where it becomes this, if not done properly, if not implemented, very conscientiously and designed by your employer to help you, the worker, what's going to happen is you're not going to work from home. You're going to live at work, essentially.
Right.
And you are going to, have a complete destruction of any semblance of work-life balance. And this is something that happened to me in 2017 when I first started working remotely. I thought it was a perk that I had to earn. And in order to earn that perk every day, I worked constantly to protect this thing that I never actually enjoyed because of the fact that I was working so hard to keep the perk. That is a real problem. And it is a definite possibility that the future of knowledge work moves in that direction, where we are all just chained to our desks all day, and employers install surveillance software that tracks our eye movements to make sure, and it's truly a nightmare. That is a nightmare future. And the office, would be better than that.
That is dystopic.
It is.
Yeah.
The bigger promise, though, is that we really believe that working from home removes you from that office environment, and that the office environment has this ability to kind of obscure or paper over a lot of the issues in organizations that make us miserable. The office and the sort of the performative busyness shows us the ways in which work creeps into all of the corners of our lives. And so I'll use myself as an example. When we were working at BuzzFeed, I met my partner there, and who's obviously my co-author. It was a fun media tech startup that was young and in its infancy, and it had a lot of cool amenities. It was really fun in the office. There was a real kind of culture of let's all go out afterwards and go to the bar and hang out. Well, all of my coworkers became my closest friends, and I started pushing all the other outside relationships in my life, sort of towards the fringes of my life. We started spending all our time with people where we worked, and then we worked more as a result, and we were kind of always in this blurred line of, is this social life or is this work? Who
Right.
can say? And it became just the normal. And then when we moved away to Montana in 2017, that distance made it immediately clear the ways in which I was a one-dimensional person. I was a work robot. I didn't have hobbies. I didn't have friendships outside of work that were really meaningful anymore. I'd let them all go fallow. My spouse was my coworker. It was really stark. And The Office did a real kind of sneaky job of obscuring that reality. And so we think that removal kind of allows you to take an inventory of your life and to see the ways in which, man, we are giving so much of ourselves to our jobs. And oftentimes we are giving the best version of ourselves and our family, our friends, our charities, our communities, whatever. Our religious institutions, they are getting what's left over. They are getting, the sort of the the end dregs in the mug of tea. And I think that's profoundly sad. And I think that it actually, highlights a lot of what's wrong in American society. That we're giving our best selves to work and not to these other institutions that really matter and contribute to the fabric of life.
So it's not just the office culture. It is the whole attitude that Americans that we have for careers, right? That the career is who you are. The career is synonymous with your identity, which means, as you point out, that there are no guardrails, that work is always there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're somewhat different than other countries. I mean, how do we compare to other, wealthy countries, people like, Germany or the Netherlands?
Yeah,
We think, Americans like to pride themselves that we're not France, but I don't think that anybody really thinks of Germans as slackers necessarily.
Yeah, I don't have the stats in front of me, but it's staggering. I mean, we work more than other countries. Let's say, maybe China, right? But it's also, it's not just the fact that we work more. It's, as you pointed out, it's the sort of valorization of it, right? And a very good example is what we've found is when a person lets work dominate their life and in an organization and completely gets rid of any semblance of work-life balance. They're sending emails out at 9 p.m. They're calling people up on weekends to, get some information, whatever it is. What that does is that doesn't happen in a vacuum. That makes more work for other people in your company. That brings other people into your orbit and sort of forces them to work. Also, everyone is comparing themselves to their colleagues and people nearby them. So then they work, in order to look good by comparison. But all of is this is the breaking of set barriers. So a lot of companies, what they do is they say, hey, we'd like you to install, some personal boundaries. We want you to, don't send email after, 6 p.m. But then the people who break those personal boundaries, they aren't, brought aside and lectured or read the riot act. They're valorized. It's wow, like the boundaries of the normal workday can't contain this really good worker. And it's a path forward. So everyone else starts competing, starts going as well. And it's really, though, it's a crappy behavior. It's a behavior, that is just highly individualistic. It has no real respect for the other people around you and what their circumstances are. And yet in American work culture, that is idealized. And I think it really, more than necessarily the hours worked, it's this idea of how much of yourself can you give to your job, and how much can you, ignore all the basic human needs that you have, like sleep or time with family. And if you can sort of, accomplish those feats of strength well, then you're a good worker, and by virtue, a good person.
So you interviewed more than 700 people for this book, and you asked them how long it would take them to complete their tasks every week. Because, of course, one of the orthodoxies that you're challenging is the whole idea of the 9 to 5 workday or the 40-hour week or anything. So, what was the feedback you got? How long does it actually take you to get the job done? What do people say?
This was one of my favorite things because it wasn't a specific question that we asked people. So we spoke to individually to over 100 people, and then we surveyed a lot of other people with a series of pretty exhaustive questions. But the question that wasn't on there was, how long does it take you to get your week's worth of work done? But in the answers, people, interestingly enough, found space in the answers to confess that, oh man, I got to tell you, I'm usually just kind of performing for my boss and sending emails that don't really matter and sitting in meetings that don't really get anything done. And then my kids go to bed at, 8 p.m. and I spend on Thursdays between 8 and, 1:30 in the morning, and I get all my work done for the week. And people would confess that, it's usually one or two really productive sprints where I get the things done that are to use a bad office term, the deliverables, right? Like the presentation gets done, or the sales get processed, whatever it is. And I thought that was so telling, that there are so many people out there who are performing for their superiors and for their coworkers instead of actually doing the work.
You've used this word several times: performing, performance, performative. That a lot of this is we sort of go through these kabuki dances of looking busy, of doing stuff, when it actually doesn't accomplish anything whatsoever. They're, the overlong meetings, pointless emails, right? Things like that. Or just, looking like you're not just hanging around, walking around the office with a coffee cup.
Yeah. And again, it's because of that. There's a few reasons, right? One is that I think that there is a real sense of precarity that hovers over so many workers in America. And obviously this pertains to frontline workers and service workers, but it pertains almost just as much to, white collar office workers. People are all, employed at will. And companies for the last many decades have gone through this, stretch of getting big and growing, and then all of a sudden downsizing and just getting rid of their workforce. So people feel this sort of sense of precarity in their jobs. And when you feel that way, what you do to compensate is you try to show your value in as many ways as is possible. Well, there isn't actually that much work to be done. And so what you end up doing is, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone. When I was working at BuzzFeed, I would wake up in the morning and I'd send a few emails just checking in with some people, because it kind of created like a paper trail, right?
Right.
It was some way to
I'm
show
here.
that I was busy.
I'm doing stuff, right? I am engaged.
And the thing that, as I mentioned before, what that does is it creates work for other people, and I think that, as silly and simple as it sounds, we don't think enough of our coworkers as real people who are just as stressed and busy and anxious and thinking about the January 6th coup, and dealing with the pandemic and sick kids and blah 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 blah. We don't think of them as that. We think of them as like nodes of productivity, right? Ways to get from A to B. And a great thing about this rethinking of work and this remote work is it really emphasizes and helps you focus on your coworkers as people and how to work with them as people, what their desires are, the ways that they work best. It's a much more intentional way of going about work.
Let me flip this around. So one of the things that's also happened is, because everybody's not putting in 9 to 5 or whatever it is, here in the Midwest, it's always 8 to 5. And with people working remotely, in some ways it kind of drains the swamp out, and we see exactly what people are doing. You just see the work product. Obviously, some workers are working harder than other workers. Some are more productive than others. there's always going to be this built-in resentment from the people who are carrying the load versus the people who are, because this is human nature, who are slacking a little bit. So there's always going to be that tension. You don't want to be the slacker, but also there's going to be resentment for the people who are, in fact, working harder, right? I mean, how do employers deal with that? How do you address that?
So I think that one of the surprises in the book, in terms of the reporting that I did, as someone who doesn't write, kind of came to this subject somewhat fresh, was I spoke to a lot of management consultants, and that sounds pretty dry, but it was some of the most interesting reporting that I've done in a while. And these people described, especially at fast growth tech companies, this phenomenon that we call in the book add-on management, which is basically there's an employee who's really good at what they do and just excels. And let's say this person is, a computer programmer, and they say, you get it. We'd really love if you would take a team of programmers and lead them. And this person is, maybe actually kind of doesn't have the greatest disposition for, social skills.
Right.
But they look at it and they say, well, it's a raise. It's maybe the only way for advancement. If I don't say yes, then I look lazy. So, okay, I'll do it. Well, these firms are so focused on growth. They move so fast. It turns out that in a lot of places, they just don't really do any meaningful training. Maybe they sit through, one session. And in some cases, they don't even know what their job is as a manager. And not only that, but they have to do their old job too. They still have to, program. They're leading a team, but they're also a part of it. And what ends up happening is that they do a terrible job managing and communicating to people what their jobs are. And you have this just dysfunctional system. And we heard all these horror stories. This, like one department had a massive gender pay disparity where the men were making, almost double the women. And finally, it got elevated up to HR. Well, it turns out it wasn't malicious. It was that the manager, the middle manager, had no idea that they were in charge of pay raises, would have loved to give this person a raise, but had no idea. And that's kind of the dysfunction that we're seeing. And the reason why I kind of preface with that long ramble is what we are seeing in general is that offices are so kind of dysfunctional and moving so fast to adapt in these environments that many workers don't actually know what their job is. And that sounds really silly, but they do their job. But there's a lot of insecurity about what are my actual responsibilities? What are my actual outputs? What is it that that I'm actually being evaluated on, as opposed to what I do every day? And what's the discrepancy between that? And a lot of managers don't necessarily know how to manage or what their job is or what's expected of them. And it creates this, it breeds a lot of the resentment that you're just talking about, right? Because you have somebody who isn't picking up a lot of the slack, and yet they're not being talked to about it. They're not being managed. The work is not fairly distributed. And that kind of resentment, you can sweep that under the rug for a while, but it always comes back up. And what it ends up doing is it blows up, and it talk about destroying productivity.
So let's talk about the Great Resignation. I mean, we're in this moment now where employers are, complaining about a labor shortage because of this Great Resignation, while you have millions of people who've been unemployed because of COVID. We should break this down a little bit. Many of the people who've quit their jobs are in the service industries, food service, others. Your book is really aimed at the 40% of people who are able to work from home and would like to continue to do it. So, I mean, there is that difference. So talk to me about what is driving the Great Resignation as you describe it in your book.
Yeah. I appreciate you making that distinction. This book is primarily focused on knowledge work, but as I'll clunkily try to describe here, I do think that there are relations to the two of them, and that some of these problems are apparent in both. So what I think is driving the Great Resignation is, in general, a similar sense of burnout, and that work is unsustainable. And in the service and sort of the frontline industries, a lot of resignations in healthcare, reacting to the treatment of medical professionals during COVID. there's this sense that they are not respected, they are not paid a fair wage, the wages are stagnant, and that it's really sort of a desperate attempt at trying to gain some worker power. And I think to some degree it is working. In the knowledge work sector, I think what's similar is that this is an attempt to speak to employers in a language that they actually understand, which is their bottom lines, which is creating, there's a lot of companies that haven't adapted well, that have forced employees back into the office, or haven't complied with COVID regulations, or don't really care that when the whole world shut down and people were hiding from a deadly virus, work continued almost as usual. People were homeschooling their kids, and there's so much resentment built up, and this feeling that employers don't trust employees to do their jobs, and employees don't trust the employers to have their best interests at heart. But what's most interesting to me about all of this, I think, is the sort of Gen Z response to coming into the workplace. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but one thing that we've seen is they're really quick to question the American notion of the career, and the very specific American notion of what we've been talking about here, which is, I am going to work all the time. I'm going to give my best self to this employer who, at any minute might downsize me and, get rid of my health insurance and, cause me to, go into a tailspin financially if I get sick when I don't have health insurance. I'm going to work for them and kind of just, take a lot of crap for 40 years. And then at the end of that time, I'm going to get a couple of years to myself, with maybe my significant other, to enjoy life to the fullest. And they're looking at that. They're seeing the way that their parents are, struggling at work with all of these same things. They're seeing, worker protections kind of stripped away broadly. And they're saying, man, that looks like a bad deal.
Okay, so this is what I wanted to get to, which is how much of this is generational. I know you saw the New York Times piece a couple of weeks ago. The 37-year-olds are afraid of the 23-year-olds who work for them. 20-somethings rolling their eyes at the habits of their elders, referring to 37-year-olds, is a longstanding trend, but many employers say there's new boldness to the way the Gen Z is dictating everything. So let me read a paragraph here. It's a fault line that crisscrosses industries and issues. At a retail business based in New York, managers were distressed to encounter young employees who wanted paid time off when coping with anxiety or period cramps. At a supplement company, a Gen Z worker questioned why she should be expected to clock in for standard 8-hour days when she might go through her to-do list by the afternoon. And we talked about that. At a biotech venture, entry-level staff members delegated tasks to the founder, and spanning sectors and startups, the youngest members of the workforce have demanded what they see as a long overdue shift away from corporate neutrality toward more open expression of values, etc. So there seems to be some real cultural tension between Gen Z, Gen X, the few boomers who are left in the workforce. How is that playing out? How significant is that in what you're describing here?
I think it is significant, and there's this way in which some of that can be framed as, oh my gosh, like look at these entitled kids coming into the thing. But if you listen to some of that stuff, what they're saying is, hey, this is inefficient. Why am I sitting here doing nothing, performing for you when I get all my work done? Why wouldn't you want me then to go and clock out, be better rested, less resentful? What we're learning in a lot of this reporting, and by looking at the way that let's say a 4-day work week boosts productivity, is that less but more focused work is often better work. And that's a pretty profound thing. But to go back to this, I think that speaking as a millennial who, basically graduated college from into the financial crisis and watched as most of my friends struggled to get jobs, and if you look at a lot of the stats where you have people of my generation looking not to earn as much as their parents, and have a sort of perhaps a lower overall standard of living. A lot of millennials came into this and sort of had to jump onto the treadmill of productivity,
Right.
as a way to survive, as a way to just, get their foot in the door. And there was this kind of feeling of precarity, uh, in terms of their careers that I think really haunts a lot of us.
So
And
you can
of
see
course,
why.
we're raised by boomers who have a very specific type of feeling towards and work ethic, which I think is rooted in their upbringings. And I think Gen Z comes in and all they know is that kind of financial precarity, right? There's just a financial crisis every
Yeah.
couple of years. There's political crises, there's climate change to deal with. And there's sort of it's a what do we have to lose kind of spirit here, right? I mean, we might only have so many years left of a healthy planet. Well, then why don't we just try to fix some of these things? And
Right.
I think it's profound. I really
You
do.
know,
I
it
know there's
is.
a way to sneer at it, and a lot of people do, but I think that they are, this is what you want out of your younger generations. You want them to question everything and try to find new ways forward instead of just blindly accepting the way that things were done before.
But you can certainly understand how the millennials would resent these entitled Gen Zers, that there'd be real tension, especially if you've spent the last several decades working your ass off, on the grindstone, to see the folks coming in and, are, not really that interested in keeping the same hours, not really the ones hanging around. I mean, they tell the story of this 30-year-old elderly guy who founds this company. And he noticed as he recruited Gen Z employees that some had no interest in the rigid work habits that felt natural to his mostly millennial 10-person team. He and his co-founder were accustomed to spending late nights in the office obsessing over customer feedback and sharing Chinese takeout. Gen Zers, they wanted to set their own hours. So who's ever right here, you can kind of imagine that there's going to be a push-pull there, and there might be some glitches in communication.
I think there's definitely going to be a lot of that, a lot of that kind of conflict. But what's interesting is I was talking to an HR consultant who basically comes into companies and that have problems in their company culture and interviews employees and then gives the dirt to executives. And what he's noticing across the board is that this conflict is already there. It's already been baked in. What's the only thing that's really fundamentally different is that this generation is airing that publicly.
Yeah.
And that is just, I think that's actually a healthier way to do things, because then you get a chance to address it. And I think that what we're in right now is this kind of interesting moment where employers are realizing just how much distrust and discontent there has been that had been sort of papered over and under the surface. And the last point I'll make with this is that this is also a result of not being in the office, because when you are removed from that environment again, it all starts to mean a little less, right? The office, we kind of not joke, but we write in the book lightly that offices are bullies. And one of the reasons they are is because they're like intimidating structures, right? Like they are just in general a reminder that the corporation is bigger and more powerful than you will ever be.
Right.
If you
They're big,
remove
you're
that,
small. Right.
if they remove that, you start to sort of see the office for what it is. And hey, maybe it's a manager who's not all that smart, not all
An
they're
idiot.
cracked up to be.
So when you talk about this being profound, really it goes back to the question that people are asking themselves: what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? And I can remember, the old adage that on people, on your deathbed, nobody ever wishes they spent more time at the office. I mean, that's been around for decades, but nobody really wanted to act on it, right? I mean, you thought it, you knew it, but this was the way things were. And now you're having this great resignation, but it's also the result of kind of this great questioning that you're discussing. What is my identity? What do I value? And feeling empowered now to think that if I value different things, then I can act on that. And I think that's kind of the point that you're making here. That is that this is a deeper and more profound shift in priorities among the workers, and the workplace is now going to have to compete with that or adapt to that.
Yeah, and so you focus a lot on politics.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at some of the real problems in American life and the way that we don't talk to each other anymore, the way that things are so bifurcated and so many people feel so disconnected and alienated and alone and angry. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but this kind of toxic relationship to work plays a part in it. It breeds in us such an individualist mentality because we have to labor all the time in order to take care of ourselves and our families. But we've kind of gotten rid of the collectivist spirit that is so crucial to making a country not just exist but thrive. I mean, if you look at American community life, it is so much more siloed. We did a lot of research into sort of the post-war membership of clubs and
Mm-hmm.
and churches and groups like like the Elks or what have you. There was so much community involvement and joining, and part of that, what that does is it allows you to see your neighbors as real people, even if you disagree with them, even if you have different backgrounds and upbringings. They're real people on the other side of things. And what American life feels like right now is this constant race. You are constantly just beating back, your bills, your inbox, your all of the demands on you, and all of this again, this precarity, and you don't have any time to participate in the community. You don't have any time to give back, and you don't have any time to see the people around you as other human beings because you're just working in service of this institution that demands so much from you. And I'm not saying again that this is, if we all work less or, reevaluate our relationships to knowledge work, that everything is going to change and the country will be united. But I think that it's a necessary shift because when we look at where we are right now, it is bleak and it is very individualistic. And I think this is a small thing that people can start to do in a sort of a reimagining that will turn us a little bit more towards that, collectivist impulse.
The book is Out of Office, The Big Problem, Bigger Promise of Working from Home by Charlie Warzel and Anne Helen Peterson. Charlie Warzel, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
And also to check out Charlie's new newsletter through the Atlantic Galaxy Brain. Thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow and do this all over again.